Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Vittorian, and this is the 25th hour helping you remember everything that happened beyond the 24/7 news cycle. Now in this week's news for the week of June 13th to 19th, 2021, de Blasio announced a parade for essential workers, Cuomo announced a 70% first vaccination rate and lifted most restrictions, Biden met with Russian President Putin and signed a bill making Juneteenth into a federal holiday, and Obamacare lives to fight another day. Now onto the show. Things may have changed by the time you hear this, starting with de Blasio. Mayor de Blasio announced that as part of the city's celebration for recovering from the pandemic and achieving high vaccination rates and low infection rates, the city is going to move forward with the Canyon of Heroes parade on July 7th to celebrate first responders.
The first true large parade in New York City will be one to celebrate the heroes of the fight against COVID, our healthcare heroes who were extraordinary and need to be remembered for the ages, our first responders, our essential workers, the people who kept us alive, the people who kept the city going no matter what. We are going to hold a parade to honor them, to thank them, to celebrate them.
Some didn't really appreciate the move, however, with the EMS union, for example, pointing out that the emergency workers need higher wages and protections instead of parades. With a record number of minority and women-owned businesses either closing or facing severe financial hardship to stay afloat because of the pandemic, the Federal Small Business Administration informed thousands of restaurants that they weren't going to get their small business loans because of legal injunctions from Texas and Louisiana, preventing the agency from favoring their businesses. The mayoral candidates had their last debate before the primary on June 22nd, with the frontrunners largely playing it safe and more bottom-of-the-pack candidates going at it. Eric Adams, seeing as being at the top of the pack, was attacked by Yang and Wiley, with Yang saying he was endorsed by the police captains union, of which Adams used to be one, and Wiley saying that the worst idea from the candidates was Adams bringing back stop and frisk, respectively.
They think I'm a better choice than Eric to keep us and our families safe.
They endorsed my opponent because some of those same captains remember Eric Adams in 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care, who fought against abuse of stop and frisk, who fought against heavy-handed policing. Okay. So, of course, they knew that Eric is going to be a voice that is not going to allow this to happen.
The worst idea I've ever heard is bringing back stop and frisk and the anti-crime unit from Eric Adams, which one is racist, two is unconstitutional.
Policing was a major topic of the debate, as were the past debates, as New Yorkers have increasingly placed safety as top of mind. Adams pointed to his experience as a cop. Wall Street executive Ray McGuire and former Sanitation Commissioner Catherine Garcia rejected defunding the police, and Comptroller Stringer, former de Blasio counsel Maya Wiley, and nonprofit executive Diane Morales rejected placing more police in the subway to combat crime in the trains. McGuire and Morales briefly went at it when Morales yelled at McGuire for, quote, speaking for black and brown New Yorkers.
Let's be very clear, for black and brown communities, neither defund the police nor stop and frisk.
You don't speak for black and brown communities. How dare you assume to speak for black and brown communities? You cannot do that.
I'm going to do it again. Black and brown communities do not want either defund or stop and frisk.
You are not speaking for all black and brown communities, because I am a member of that community, and you are certainly not speaking for me.
And Yang spurred some controversy by saying,
yes, mentally ill people have rights, but you know who else have rights? We do. The people and families of the city. We have the right to walk the street and not fear for our safety because a mentally ill person is going to lash out at us.
Yang later said after the debate that he could have better presented his comments on those with mental illness. The candidates didn't really flesh out what kind of legacy development project they'd aim to achieve if they were elected, but the debate did have substantive conversation about in-depth issues facing the city. Adams is currently in the lead with 21% of a final ranked choice voting round, with Catherine Garcia at 20%. Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams hasn't swatted away questions about where he truly lives, as it was reported he co-owns a co-op with a partner in New Jersey, where he took part in Zoom forums from during the summer as he was attacking Andrew Yang for staying at a vacation home during the pandemic. Adams is also being questioned about his property ownership, as records show Adams failed to disclose partial ownership in a Brooklyn apartment in Prospect Heights, which Adams said he gave away to friend Sylvia Cohen for free. Adams continues to stress his law and order plank, using recent incidents like a gun landing in front of his campaign office as examples for a bigger crackdown on crime. Adams also landed in a hot spot for saying that remote learning allowing 300 to 400 students per teacher can be a positive for the city education system, according to a recording of an interview from February. Reporting from Political New York also showed that Adams had used the space occupied by the Brooklyn Democratic Party's law firm since January of last year without disclosing it on his campaign finance forms. Despite early voting having started this past Sunday, low turnout still infest the race, with off-year elections regularly turning out a small number of New Yorkers deciding the city's future. The first 4 days of early voting only had a little more than 64,000 New Yorkers come out to vote, out of a 3.6 million registered Democrats and 500,000 Republicans in the city. The Queens Eagle reported that Queens has the lowest percentage of registered voters who cast an early ballot, with about 18,000 Queens voters out of 1.2 million coming out. Mayor de Blasio still refuses to make an endorsement in the race, calling the candidates uninspiring but maintaining that he respects them. Rumors are that he favors Eric Adams, however. The candidates wouldn't enthusiastically accept de Blasio's endorsement, as most New Yorkers disapprove of his leadership. Adams is enjoying a closing of ranks around him from Democratic leaders, as he's a perceived top candidate of the race, with former Governor David Paterson endorsing him this week, along with Manhattan Democrats leader Keith Wright. Catherine Garcia broke from her fellow mayoral candidates this week by supporting the chokehold law, which bans the police from performing certain maneuvers that close off suspects' airways, inspired by the death of Eric Garner when former officer Daniel Pantaleo put him in a chokehold. Andrew Yang and Catherine Garcia announced that they're going to campaign together over the weekend, representing a shift in alliances that only happened because of the ranked choice voting system put in place now. Listeners may recall a former incident where Andrew Yang said that Catherine Garcia would make a good number 2 for him, and now they're campaigning together. Former de Blasio council Maya Wiley claimed ownership over a program that de Blasio handed over to her to provide free Wi-Fi among NYCHA residents, even though records show that the program failed to actually deliver on its promises. 6 years after the program was announced and $10 million were spent, only the Queensbridge houses in Long Island City got Wi-Fi, while the Red Hook and Mott Haven houses still don't. Meanwhile, on the Republican side of the mayoral campaign, vigilante group Guardian Angels founder Curtis Sliwa is polling ahead of taxi and bodega group leader Fernando Mateo, 33 to 27. ProPublica reported on Manhattan DA candidate Tali Farhadi and Weinstein this week, finding that she paid only about $6,600 in federal income taxes in 2014 and paying nothing in 2013 and 2015, despite reporting joint income in $107 million in 2011 with her husband, according to documents leaked from the IRS, showing other high earners either barely paying or not paying any federal income tax. Weinstein donated about $8 million to her own campaign for Manhattan DA. For whatever it's worth, Weinstein was endorsed by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. The Manhattan DA candidates had their own debate this week, with the aspiring future top prosecutors piling on Tali Farhadi and Weinstein. De Blasio announced the Juneteenth Economic Justice Plan commemorating the new federal holiday celebrating the end of slavery, which includes college scholarships accounts for kindergartners, CUNY scholarships for black students, and 200 paid internship slots. Even though police were criticized for a rather heavy-handed response to people staying past the 10 p.m. curfew at Washington Square Park, residents around the park told the police at a neighborhood meeting to keep the curfew in order to keep away drug use and noise. Commissioner Shea called the violence at the park abhorrent this week. Police Commissioner Dermot Shea, who's often been absent from press conferences, finally appeared at one during one of the mayor's press conferences, the first since March 12th. Shea talked about the increased use of fake license plates as a way to escape being linked to more serious crimes and remained adamant that the police were working on an increased rate of gun crimes. The police are reportedly targeting Midtown with patrols and blockades as crime and illegal drug sales increase, according to the Wall Street Journal, which blames the placement of homeless people in the area to the rising appearance of drug deals. In-person jail visits will resume next week, according to the Department of Corrections, but visitors will still have to practice social distancing, wear masks, and go through temperature checks and screening. Hundreds of internal MTA incident reports have painted a horrid picture of dirty subway cars at the start of the year, with train cars filled with garbage, blood, vomit, and more. Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg might be arrested and charged soon, it seems, as Manhattan prosecutors are lining up their evidence for a grand jury against the man who apparently knows where the bodies are buried. A year after COVID forced the city to use hotels to house homeless adults and families, and neighborhoods protested against the practice, de Blasio announced that the city is ready to relocate 8,000 homeless people out of hotels and back into the shelter system. The state has to greenlight the move, said the mayor. The Wall Street Journal reported on the FAA stalling of the AirTrain project at LaGuardia Airport, slated to cost about $2.1 billion, after activists and Congress members pointed out legitimate concerns about the environmental review process, saying that the agency was favoring a rail link over other forms of infrastructure. Over at the City Council, overlooked from the noise of the mayoral race this year are all of the City Council races which promise to show a different council due to the amount of term-limited council members on the way out. The New York Times reported on the progressive push to install new candidates instead of moderates, with groups like the Working Families Party campaigning to place their choices in the legislative body. Dropping some coin too, however, are the 5 PACs, funded by 5 unions, raising $2 million to support 47 city council candidates, with Brooklyn area candidate Crystal Hudson getting a lion's share of the dough, according to the city. The council is ready to pass 2 pending bills that would ease fines against small businesses that were incurred at the height of the pandemic, as well as update sanitation and other code violations, bringing relief to businesses that were accused of violating them. Community Board 7 in Queens voted 42-3 to try and get rid of one of their fellow board members, John Cho, who's running for a city council seat for allegedly taking bribes in exchange for a favorable vote on a new development, which Cho strongly denies. Cho will be able to defend himself in proceedings before the board takes a final vote. Despite facing some serious health concerns, Councilman Bill Perkins is looking like he'll cruise to re-election for his seat in Manhattan, according to an article from City and State. Over the Cuomo administration, higher vaccination rates and a low infection rate isn't the only sign that the state is coming back post-pandemic. Sales tax revenue around the state increased government coffers by 57%, bringing revenue to $140 billion, a $530 million increase from last year. Cuomo announced that with the state reaching a 70% one-shot vaccination rate, he was lifting most of the state's pandemic restrictions on businesses and social gatherings.
And now we get back to living in life. The state mandates that have proven right and correct and brought us through this pandemic are relaxed as of today, effective immediately.
There won't be any more 6-foot social distance tables or temperature checks. Businesses will still have the ability to put in place their own health policies. The state's unemployment rate dropped below 8%, still almost double what it was before the pandemic started, and above the national average of 5.8%. Cuomo announced the closure of several mass vaccination sites now that the state has hit a 70% first shot rate, potentially closing off a route for those who are still amenable to getting their first shot at all. The Times reported on how Cuomo's sister and his allies funded a former aide's legal bills. Joseph Prococo, once one of Cuomo's closest aides, was convicted of taking more than $300,000 in bribes from contractors with business before the state. And even though Cuomo kept his distance, Cuomo's sister Madeline was part of a group raising money for Prococo's legal bills for years. Cuomo claims no knowledge of the fundraising. A new report by the Long-Term Care Task Force of the New York State Bar Association justifies Cuomo's actions that caused the increased deaths of nursing home residents by having the health department issue a directive early in the pandemic, keeping COVID-afflicted nursing home residents in their nursing homes as long as the home can care for the resident and couldn't reject the resident based on a suspected case of COVID. The task force said the state's unique situation battling COVID made the directive understandable, but still directly led to the deaths of residents. Republican Congressman Lee Zeldin is shoring up support from his Republican state colleagues, receiving the endorsement of state senators Ed Rath, George Borrello, and Mike Martucci this week. Zeldin might also receive the backing of the state Republican Party in a presumptive vote, with the party trying to avoid a costly primary battle. Rochester Mayor Lovely Warren, despite investigations into her role in the Daniel Prude case and the arrest of her ex-husband on drugs and gun charges, still maintains her local support even though combined with her scandals, crime, poverty, and racial disparities haven't improved much, reports Political New York. Long Island Suffolk County Fair Housing Task Force made recommendations to get rid of housing discrimination, including undercover testing of real estate brokers and others in the market, making a rating system for real estate agents, and looking into how towns use their county funding to promote fair housing. In Long Island's other county, Nassau, the county has reached an agreement with the police union that will see cops wear body cameras in exchange for $3,000 for each camera being used. Meanwhile, Nassau County Police Commissioner Patrick Ryder is facing calls to resign after making comments that the reason why more black and Hispanic officers weren't being hired was essentially because they come from, quote, broken homes. Ryder said that he wasn't going to resign over the comments. The State Bar Association put its 2 cents into the conversation revolving around how municipalities around the state are approaching police reform, releasing a 114-page report recommending mandating body cameras, increasing diversity among police ranks, and increasing the amount of time spent training in the police academy. Over in the state legislature, the state Republican legislators decried Assembly members Monica Wallace and Karen McMahon for dining with Governor Cuomo while being members of the Judiciary Committee with jurisdiction over Cuomo's impeachment investigation for his nursing home and sexual assault scandals. Wallace and McMahon said they were a part of a state delegation meeting with the governor to talk about infrastructure for Western New York, although it was reported that Wallace took a tour of the executive mansion with Cuomo afterwards. With the legislature having wrapped up its session and passing hundreds of bills, they pointedly didn't end up reversing the state of emergency declaration for the pandemic, which granted many of Cuomo's emergency powers, which he was being accused of abusing his authority with. The declaration remains in place, and so does Cuomo's authority to change his current emergency decrees after his authority to make up new emergency ones was taken away by the legislature. The state capitol building in Albany, a year after being closed due to the pandemic and the January 6th insurrection delaying reopening, has reopened this week just as the legislature has gone home for the year. Over at the state judiciary, a lawsuit filed by Black Lives Matter demonstrators in state court alleges that Rochester sheriff's deputies used a military arsenal against Black Lives Matter protesters last summer, including pepper balls, tear gas, batons, and kinetic bullets, with the second lawsuit joining the state and state police as sharing responsibility in abuse against George Floyd demonstrators. A state appellate court has also ruled against the Rochester Police Accountability Board from being able to take any disciplinary action against cops, who the board finds guilty of infractions, with the board's recommendations now being toothless. Disgraced movie mogul and rapist Harvey Weinstein is now being extradited to California from New York to face more molestation and assault charges, according to a ruling from Erie County Judge Kenneth Case. The Federal Southern District of New York announced that it's going to relax COVID protocols in its courtrooms, with fully vaccinated people allowed to walk around without their masks and no longer needing to social distance. The same rules are being relaxed throughout the state court system, according to the Court of Appeals. The State Bar Association released a recommendation from a task force with the job of looking into whether New York State should have its own bar exam developed, as the State Bar is concerned that new lawyers don't have an understanding of New York State case law. The recommendation was to develop a new bar exam emphasizing New York State law. Over at the Biden administration, Biden announced that his administration is going to invest $3.2 billion in developing COVID antiviral pills, with the money coming from the American Rescue Plan passed earlier in the year. The pills can potentially be taken in lieu of a vaccine in the early stages of infection to prevent hospitalization or death. The money will be used to support clinical trials and manufacturing.
It's a whole of government effort aimed at developing the next generation of COVID-19 treatments, as well as preparing us for future threats. The program is called the Antiviral Program for Pandemics, and it aims to catalyze the development of new medicines to combat COVID-19 and, importantly, to prepare for other pandemic threats.
The president also said that his administration was ordering another $200 million worth of Moderna vaccines. The Health and Human Services Department's Inspector General announced that the office is going to look into National Institute of Health grants that could have gone to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has become the center of renewed attention and allegations that COVID leaked from that lab. In the meantime, the NIH released a study published in the Clinical Infectious Diseases Journal that found COVID may have reached the U.S. as early as December 2019, weeks earlier than believed, with a blood donor COVID antibody test from January 7, 2020, revealing positive results. After momentum quickened the speed with which the House and Senate passed a measure making Juneteenth a holiday, Biden signed the bill into law, giving federal workers a day off on Friday to celebrate the ending of slavery. Juneteenth, celebrated on June 19th, commemorates the day when Texas slaves found out that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed them 2 years after the fact. It was the first federal holiday instated since 1983 with Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Juneteenth marks both the long, hard night of slavery and subjugation and a promise of a brighter morning to come. This is a day of profound, in my view, profound weight and profound power. A day in which we remember the moral stain, the terrible toll that slavery took on the country and continues to take.
Unemployment claims increased a bit to 412,000 last week after dropping the week prior to a pandemic low. The Federal Reserve is preparing for the possibility to raise interest rates a little after trying to calm down investors and markets to the possibility of a prolonged rise in inflation, saying it's all just temporary, but forecasting a 3% rise this year. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, for her part, is also trying to calm the market down by saying there's a correction going on in the economy as the country climbs out of the pandemic. The Biden administration expanded an Obama-era program that would allow a legal pathway to citizenship for Central American minors from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador by opening up the program for tens of thousands of children and teens under 21. Attorney General Merrick Garland also officially rescinded a Trump-era ruling that made it almost impossible to claim domestic abuse or gang violence as reasons for claiming asylum in the U.S. The Education Department has issued a regulatory ruling that defines discrimination against transgender students as a violation under Title IX, the law that codifies anti-discrimination against sex and gender orientation. The Education Department also canceled the student debt of 18,000 former students of the now-defunct ITT Technical Institute, Education Secretary Miguel Cardona announced. The students petitioned the Trump administration to cancel the student debt after the school shut down in 2016 under fraud charges, but were rejected. Biden released his fourth wave of judicial nominees for vacant federal benches, nominating 5 people to the federal bench, including Miranda Perez, director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Elections Program at NYU Law School, to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Biden also chose a list of ambassadors and nominated them for various posts, including former Interior Secretary Ken Salazar as the new Mexican ambassador, former Deputy Secretary of State Thomas Nines as the new Israeli ambassador, Secretary of State Advisor Gillian Smith as the new NATO ambassador, and even former pilot C.B. Sully Sullenberger, famously known for landing a plane on the Hudson River to save his passengers, for a post with the International Civil Aviation Organization. The DOJ requested that the death penalty be reinstated against Boston Marathon bomber Jakar Tsarnaev, who killed 3 and injured hundreds in 2013 with his brother, who died that same day. A lower appellate court took off the original death penalty, saying that potential juror bias during jury selection and the exclusion of relevant mitigating evidence made the death penalty inappropriate. The DOJ's decision to argue for the reinstatement of the capital punishment frustrated anti-death penalty activists because of Biden's own personal opposition to capital punishment. The DOJ has halted its lawsuit against former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton for alleged national security leaks in his book, recounting his time in the Trump administration. An Associated Press investigation delved into the amount of firearms lost by the U.S. Army and the resulting cover-up. Some lost guns were actually stolen and were used for robberies and shootings, and were in some cases sold to street gangs. The Army had battled the Associated Press to reject reporters' Freedom of Information Act requests. After Biden left his meeting with the G7 nations and got them to adopt a statement vowing to offset a rising Russia and China, he went on to meet the 30 member countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was formed to counteract against the Soviet Union and today acts as a Western military alliance. Biden also settled a 17-year trade dispute with the EU over subsidies paid to airplane manufacturers Boeing and Airbus, extending tariff suspensions. Biden also lifted a 25% tariff on Scotch against the UK, instated under Trump's tenure. After meeting with NATO, Biden went on to meet Russian President Putin, who was giving interviews with English-language broadcasters justifying his own actions of oppression by saying America does the same thing. Specifically talking about hacks and jailing opposition leader Alexei Navalny, Putin said the U.S. hacks as well and pointed to arrests of the January 6th Capitol rioters as somehow being a crackdown on dissent. Biden also gave answers to journalists' questions ahead of the meeting, calling Putin a worthy adversary, but said there are areas for the two countries to work together. The meeting went visually off to an awkward start, with both leaders barely making eye contact and speaking through interpreters, but after the first round of discussions, Putin and Biden had separate press conferences where they revealed an agreement to restaff their respective countries' embassies with ambassadors again and work on a host of issues, including cybersecurity and arms control. No word on whether conversations revolved around freeing 2 imprisoned Americans in Russia, Trevor Reed and Paul Whelan. After Biden got back to the White House following his European trip, he said that he got everything he wanted out of his meeting with the Russian president, while saying that there's more work left to be done.
It was important to meet in person, so there can be no mistake about or misrepresentations about what I wanted to communicate. I did what I came to do. Number 1, identify areas of practical work our two countries can do to advance our mutual interest and also benefit the world. 2, communicate directly that the United States will respond to actions that impair our vital interest or those of our allies. And 3, to clearly lay out our country's priorities and our values, so he heard it straight from me. And I must tell you, the tone of the entire meetings, I guess it was a total of 4 hours, was good, positive. There wasn't any strident action taken. Where we disagreed, I disagreed, stated where it was. Where he disagreed, he stated. But it was not done in a hyperbolic atmosphere. That is too much of what's been going on. There's much more work ahead. I'm not suggesting that any of this is done. We've gotten a lot of business done on this trip.
He briefly snapped at a reporter, questioning why the reporter had to be so negative about his meeting with Putin.
Why are you so confident he'll change his behavior, Mr. President?
Yeah, I'm not confident in changing behavior. What the hell? What do you do all the time? So when did I say I was confident?
You said in the next 6 months you'll be able to determine.
What I said was, let's get it straight. I said what will change their behavior is if the rest of the world reacts to them and it diminishes their standing in the world. I'm not confident of anything. I'm just stating the fact.
But given his past behavior has not changed, and in that press conference after sitting down with you for several hours, he denied any involvement in cyber attacks. He downplayed human rights abuses. He even refused to say Alexei Navalny's name. So how does that account to a constructive meeting as President Putin?
You don't understand that. You're in the wrong business.
Is the summit with China next?
I owe my last question an apology. I shouldn't have been such a wise guy with the last answer I gave. Look, to be a good reporter, you got to be negative. You got to have a negative view of life. Okay, it seems to me the way you never ask a positive question. Why, in fact, having agreement? We'll find out. We have an agreement to work on a major arms control agreement. I started working on arms control agreements back all the way during the Cold War. If we could do one in the Cold War, why couldn't we do one now? We'll see. The thing that always amazed me about the questions, and I apologize for having been short on this before. If you were in my position, would you say, well, I don't think, man, anything's going to happen. It's going to be really rough. I think it's going to really be bad. You guarantee nothing happens. You guarantee nothing happens. So there's a value far, there's a value to being realistic and put on an optimistic front, an optimistic face.
Just after a new mixed coalition led by pro-settlement activist and former Netanyahu chief of staff Naftali Bennett was sworn in, deposing Benjamin Netanyahu after ruling Israel since 2009 as prime minister, Gaza was bombarded again with aircraft missiles following Hamas's send-off of incendiary balloons filled with explosives. The balloons were released after a right-wing march took place in Israel by a group that celebrates the capture of East Jerusalem by Israel, seen by Palestinians as a provocation. No word yet from Biden or Secretary of State Blinken on the recent escalation. The head of U.S. Central Command, General Frank McKenzie, overseeing the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, said that the only airstrikes that would occur in Afghanistan from now on would be in case of a planned attack against the U.S. or its allies. Biden reached a deal with Turkey, providing the country support in exchange for Turkey defending Afghanistan's Kabul airport. At the same time, Afghanistan is seeing a renewed outbreak of COVID, and it has reached the U.S. Embassy with 100 staffers getting sick and one dying. The military is going to decrease its anti-missile systems in the Middle East and what the administration is calling a realignment in its focus on the region, pivoting to countering China's rise on the global stage. The reduction in the anti-missile batteries coincides with the withdrawal in Afghanistan. Over in Iran, an election just concluded, resulting in a hardline judge, Ebrahim Raisi, winning the office of the presidency, who opposes diplomacy, putting a spotlight on what will happen next to efforts to bring Iran and the U.S. back to the negotiating table. The election was marred by low turnout, with moderates staying home to protest the election being tipped in Raisi's favor. Over in Congress and starting in the House passed a bill repealing the 2002 War Powers Authorization Resolution, originally giving President Bush the authority to invade Iraq based on false intelligence that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and harbored terrorists responsible for 9/11. The authorization had since been used to justify various military acts since Obama and Trump. Biden argued on the campaign trail that the War Powers Resolution is outdated and supports its repeal. The measure goes to the Senate now, where Majority Leader Schumer expressed support for it before. The House Judiciary Committee sent out its first request this week to Attorney General Merrick Garland for information regarding the subpoena sent out by Trump's Department of Justice during his time in office, requesting electronic information on reporters and House Democrats who were either reporting or investigating on the former president. The DOJ said that it would end the practice of asking for gag rules when requesting sensitive subpoenas and would end going after reporters' digital information altogether in leak cases. The head of the Justice Department's National Security Division, John Demers, stepped down this week amongst the attention into the leaks investigation. Demers was the last remaining Trump holdout from his administration. The House awarded congressional gold medals to police officers that defended lawmakers during the January 6th insurrection this week, with 21 Republicans voting against giving them the medals. One Republican, Thomas Massey of Kentucky, took umbrage at the term insurrectionist used to describe the insurrections during the January 6th insurrection, and another, Andrew Clyde of Georgia, refused to shake the hand of Officer Michael Fanone, who was injured that day. Over at the Senate, some might say that Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is off to his tricks again, or maybe he never stopped, but McConnell made it clear that if the Republicans win back control of the Senate, he isn't going to allow another Democratic nominee to the Supreme Court, no matter what time of year it is. McConnell had blocked the nomination of Merrick Garland when he was nominated to the Supreme Court by Obama following the death of Antonin Scalia, saying that it was an election year, that it would be irresponsible to put up a Democratic nominee before voters had time to choose, even though it was actually more than a year away from elections. This time around, McConnell made it clear that it didn't matter the timing, it's about a Democrat nominating someone to the court. Democrats' patience has just about run out when it comes to infrastructure negotiations, as Majority Leader Schumer moved forward on procedures to initiate reconciliation, which potentially sidelines Republicans on a vote for a potential bill. Budget reconciliation is a way for the Senate to get around the supermajority needed to bypass a filibuster by requiring a simple majority vote on a bill, but only if it has something to do with the federal budget. Bernie Sanders, who heads the Finance Committee, said that he's working on a $6 trillion proposal that would push forward non-infrastructure policies such as reducing the cost of drugs, with centrist Democrats balking at the price tag. But just as progressives started crying out about how their patience is running out, the bipartisan group negotiating with the White House on a nearly $1 trillion infrastructure proposal has been gaining supporters, with 21 senators now supporting the compromise. 11 Republicans, 9 Democrats, and independent Senator Angus King. The moderate Democrat, usually found in the middle of both the infrastructure and voting rights issues, signaled a possible compromise between moderates and progressives on a voting rights bill already passed in the House. The West Virginia Democrat Joe Manchin earlier said that he wouldn't support reforming the filibuster to allow a simple majority vote on civil rights issues, leading other Democrats to call him an enabler of racism. Manchin this week circulated a letter that publicly listed what measures he supported in the bill, but hasn't said how he vote next week, when the measure is expected to be placed on the floor. Either way, Republicans are set to vote against the bill, with Minority Leader Mitch McConnell criticizing Manchin's compromise as the same rotten core of a bill, and pointing out that it had become politically convenient for Republicans to oppose his compromises after Stacey Abrams, the failed Georgia governor candidate and voting rights stalwart, endorsed his pitch. Separately, Manchin also said that he wouldn't guarantee supporting going through budget reconciliation to achieve an infrastructure bill, placing that plan in jeopardy since every Democratic vote is necessary in the 50-50 Senate, with Vice President Harris being the tie-breaking vote. Biden's nominee to replace Merrick Garland on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, a very powerful appellate court for the type of cases it decides in the nation's capital, Ketanji Brown Jackson was confirmed by the Senate this week on a 53-44 vote. Jackson is widely regarded as a potential future Supreme Court pick. Lena Khan was also confirmed by the Senate to join the Federal Trade Commission. Khan has a history of criticizing big tech companies like Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Apple, indicating a shift to cracking down on the big Silicon Valley companies that control nearly every facet of Americans' digital lives. Over at the federal judiciary, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of a Catholic foster care agency that discriminated against gay couples looking to foster a child after the city of Philadelphia terminated its foster care contract with the agency in 2018. Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the whole court, said that the Catholic agency wasn't seeking to impose its views on anyone else and wanted to be treated like other agencies Philadelphia gives accommodations to. The ruling was a continuation in a trend favoring religious freedoms, but was narrow on the facts, counter to the hopes from religious freedom absolutists looking for a more widespread rule. The court also ruled in favor of the Nestle and Cargill companies against 6 Malian plaintiffs that claimed the companies participated in child trafficking to work as slaves on cocoa farms in the Ivory Coast. Justice Thomas, writing for the 8-1 majority, said the plaintiffs didn't prove Nestle and Cargill made decisions to profit off the farms in the U.S., a prerequisite under the Alien Tort Statute, which empowers U.S. courts to have jurisdiction over claims made by foreign nationals against companies that allegedly violated international law. For a third time, the Supreme Court saved the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, from being scrapped. Texas and other Republican-led states sued the government, claiming that since the individual mandate forcing people to get health care was rescinded by a Republican Congress, the rest of the law can't stand. However, Justice Breyer, writing for a 7-2 court, wrote that the Republican states don't have standing anymore precisely because the mandate was repealed. Without the mandate, Republicans don't have an injury to claim, and Obamacare lives another day. The court rejected retroactively reducing the sentences of inmates in prison for small amounts of crack cocaine possession, saying the text of the First Step Act doesn't allow for the specific type of retroactive reduction in sentences, as in the case of the plaintiff Tararik Terry, despite the bill's authors Chuck Grassley and Dick Durbin saying that that was their intent. Justice Sotomayor released a concurring opinion calling on Congress to fix the issue. The First Step Act was signed into law by Trump with the aim of taking a step back from the heavy-handed enforcement of war on drug crimes. Texas District Court Judge Lynn Hughes dismissed the lawsuit filed by more than 100 nurses from Methodist Hospital attempting to fight back against mandates to take a COVID vaccine in order to come back to work. The nurses saying the vaccines are experimental even though they're not, and claiming it's illegal to mandate an emergency use vaccine had their lawsuit swatted away as more businesses seek to navigate their way back to normalcy. Following Biden's executive order to pause the new oil and gas leases awarded to company under the Trump administration, Louisiana District Judge Terry Doughty issued a stay temporarily blocking Biden's pause after a lawsuit was brought by the Louisiana Attorney General and 12 other Republican-led states. The lawyer that formerly represented porn star Stormy Daniels in her fight against former President Trump and who's now facing charges of extortion against apparel company Nike should receive a substantial prison sentence according to federal prosecutors ahead of his June 30th sentencing hearing. Avenatti was convicted for threatening to publicly say Nike pays the families of college basketball stars unless Nike paid him $25 million. New York Eastern District Senior Judge Jack Weinstein passed away this week at the age of 99, having been inactive since 2020 after serving 53 years as a judge. The U.S. Florida District Court Judge Stephen Merriday issued a preliminary injunction in favor of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to stop the CDC from enforcing its rules on the cruise ship industry. The court said the CDC data is stale and didn't take vaccines into account and will only continue as guidelines as opposed to rules. The CDC has until July 2nd to reissue new guidance. Over in national news, the U.S. has reached the grim milestone of passing 600,000 deaths from COVID a little more than a year after the pandemic reached American soil, despite the rate of vaccinations increasing and positive testing rates declining. The U.S. drug company Novavax reported that its vaccine has a 90% efficacy rate against COVID with a 100% rating preventing moderate and severe disease. The company said it won't seek U.S. approval in September, while it's currently seeking approval in the EU, India, South Korea, and the UK. Public health experts are mounting alarms over a new Delta variant of COVID spreading around the world, becoming the new dominant strain in the UK and other countries. The World Health Organization says 80 countries have been infected by the new strain, which is 60% more transmissible than the original. The mutation makes up 10% of the cases in the U.S. right now. Vaccines remain effective against the Delta variant. The western U.S. is in its worst drought in history, with 72% of land in severe drought and 26% in exceptional drought, and millions of Americans are demanding more water as water restrictions go in place. Temperatures hit 118 degrees Fahrenheit in Phoenix, breaking records, as a heat wave coupled with drought conditions are affecting 40 million Americans in the West. A gathering of Catholic bishops representing the religion in the U.S. voted to create a document that outlines how someone can receive communion, the ritual by which people symbolically take in the body and blood of Jesus by eating bread and wine, respectively. The document can take aim at those like Biden who take public positions supporting abortion, yet is personally against it. Pope Francis has cautioned the group of bishops against taking their course of action as unnecessarily divisive. A Republican congressional candidate in Florida threatened to call a Russian and Ukrainian hit squad against a primary opponent this week, according to a 30-minute phone call leaked showing William Braddock warning a conservative activist not to support primary opponent Anna Paulina Luna. South Carolina reportedly halted executions in the state until its new firing squad option can be finalized, after death row inmate Brad Keith Sigmund petitioned the state to halt his meeting with the electric chair. After reporting last week that Texas Governor Greg Abbott is continuing Trump's crusade to build a wall along the southern border with Mexico, Abbott announced that he put down a $250 million down payment for the construction of the wall and would crowdsource the rest of the funding necessary to build it. And that's it for this week's show of the 25th Hour, helping you stay on top of the 24/7 news cycle. Don't forget to rate us on Apple Podcasts, share us with your friends, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can email your tips and suggestions at the25thhournews@gmail.com and become a patron today for as low as $2 a month to support the show at patreon.com/the25thhournews. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.